All right. Thank you all for joining. So for the ones who don't know me, I'm Joe Hsueh from SIMFO. And actually, I just realized my name is spelled wrong. Hold on. Should be E-U-E-H, not E-U-H. Hold on.
Although you can't blame anybody else for misspelling your name.
Yeah, I know. Huh? Okay, now we
No, he actually can. It was me. I did it.
Okay.
I've only known him for 8 years. I'll get it right one of these days.
Great. So yeah, so I'm Joe, and I am the co-founder and CEO of SIMFO, System Impact Multifamily Office. Today, I would like to welcome you to on this special session on systems mapping for system change. I've been working in this field for more than a decade. My background is in something called system dynamics, where I did my PhD at MIT Sloan. So my field comes from that type of system mapping. There are different types of system mapping. So my background is more system dynamics type of system mapping, and I've been applying this methodology to help facilitate multi-stakeholder collaboration, bringing both the resource, the fund, change side, and the resource side, the investors and funders together to collectively catalyze system change. So today I'd like to share with you some of our experiences and different types of map we use under different conditions. We'll share a few cases and also have a little exercise. So let me start by sharing my screen. Just give me one sec. Entire screen. Share. Okay. So I'll be co-leading this with my colleague Brian on the line here as well. System mapping for investing in system change. We spent about 55 minutes for some of the presentation, the case. We have a mini workshop for 25 minutes and then QA next steps in the last 10 minutes. I want to give you some introduction on why systems mapping, why is it needed, some basic system thinking language, and the types of maps and their objective under different phases of system change. Why system mapping? This, in a way, says it all. We are dealing with complex challenges, climate change, poverty, all these complex challenges are like this big elephant, right? No one sees the whole system, but we all each own a piece of the puzzle. So diversity allows us to see the system from many perspectives. If we only act from our silo perspective, you will have unintended consequences, right? And create the very structure that we are stuck in right now. We must connect to see the whole. This is where mapping can help us bring the elephant, surface that out explicitly, so we can dialogue on it and find those solutions. Why SIMFO, my firm exists, I would say it's trying to solve this problem. Is this change maker investor relationship. The current reality is more like this fragmentation. The red ones are various projects, either NGO seeking grants or social enterprise seeking impact investments. The red dot, the green dots are various investments. They chosen certain project. So projects are in some ways working hard on their own way, and investors are looking for those projects to invest. Problem with this picture is it can be done at the project level, one by one, and also in a silo sort of one-on-one way. Whereas a potentially more ideal way is the other way. It is a desired future, where on the change side, on the various projects, there is underlying structure that create the very problem we are trying to solve. And so those projects are hitting on different parts of that system. There are interconnections. In fact, there are causal connections among them. So the first step is to map out the underlying causal structure of that very problem, then source those projects, then identify where those projects that hits those so-called high leverage points places to intervene that has highest impact. So we must have done this type of analysis through systems mapping to identify lever source those projects. And that's on the change side. On the resource side, how do we then bring the individual funders to create a collective funding mechanism so that we can collectively grant and invest to shift the system together? Right, so it's integration both on the change side, the resource side, and bring them together to shift the system. We help try to bring both sides together to catalyze system change. Here are the 6 ongoing initiatives that we currently have on climate, biodiversity, education, culture, health, and finance. And here are the list of lead change maker and lead funder. I say lead because they are not the only one, but they lead because they are interested in taking this systems approach, and then they bring other change maker and funders along the way to build this field. And I will share a few cases from this list. So the mission is to support change maker to realize system change by working with purpose-driven family, to collaboratively grant system change initiative and invest in market-based solutions for regenerative and inclusive economy. And why do we need it? The current reality is more like people working hard on their work by silently, but they are working on different actions. We started to have point-to-point collaboration, right? Connecting different dots, and then we create incremental change. To move collective action to catalyze system change, the first step we need to have is to form a shared mission and vision. We're looking towards the same North Star. That's the very first step. Then we must see the underlying causal structure, systemic structure that generate the very problem we're trying to solve, so that we can redesign the structure to create a future that we want. So this is where the mapping of the underlying causal structure comes in, so that we can identify those leverage points that we should focus on and act on those leverage points so that we can shift the system together. And the process over our many years of experience, they boil down to 3 phases, if you will. First stage is system design, which is what I will share with you today through a lot of mapping, convening, working with the stakeholders, so we come to a shared strategy. After we have that shared strategy, it's important to build community, right? We're talking about a population scale change. So building that community with a shared value, a shared vision, so that we can have a cross-sectoral collaboration. And through blended finance, we facilitate grants, impact investment, and various fundings, public financing into the very system that we are trying to shift together. Now I'll come to some basic language. So what I explained is the why and some of the processes. Now I want to say a little bit about the tool. How do we go about doing mapping? To do mapping, a very first step is to identify variables in this system. Variables are something, they are basic elements in the system, right? They follow sort of 2 principles. Usually they're written as nouns and they are changeable, either can go up or down. An example would be, consumption of Coca-Cola consumption. You can go up or down. My weight, how heavy I am, can go up and down. Carbon tax, increase, decrease. Carbon emission, net profit, shareholder dividend. Those are variables that can be quantifiable in some way that we can see its direction. So first time when we do any mapping, you want to identify those key variables affecting your system. Sometimes we will name variable, they are not very precise. Here are 2 examples, color and weather. When you say color, I don't mean, what do you mean by, what element or what characteristic of the color or weather? That's not as precise. I'm gonna do a little interactive session here. Can you guys help me make this 2 term, make color a little bit more precise as a variable? Anybody has an idea? What about color? that you want to name as a variable.
How about specific colors like red or green or blue?
Okay. So if I talk about specific color and I put red color, maybe you want to say variety of color. Then it is a quantity that can go up and down, right? Or yeah.
So yeah, other better suggestions: intensity, spectrum.
Intensity, spectrum, yeah, right.
Those are very cool.
Exactly.
Dark versus light.
Level, right. Yeah, perfect. And what about weather? Could be the temperature, right? Or humidity. All those are more precise way of capturing what you want to capture in the system. So the very first step is name your variable precise. The best map are the maps where the reader read without explanation. They can understand the map, right? We are trying to use map to tell a very complex story when we're doing system change. If you can create a map, the causal logic is clear, the variable is clear, it will really facilitate communication and collaboration. So that's variable. Then comes to the causal linkages. There are two types. The first is positive causality. So there are two variables, cause and effect. The amount of Coca-Cola consumption increase will increase our body weight. So the cause and effect are moving in the same direction. We usually put a solid line or a positive sign here that denote they are positive causality. Same thing if they move in the downwards. When the net profit goes down, the shareholder dividend goes down. So it's also a positive causality. Then we use a solid line. There is another type, which is when they are moving in the opposite direction. That's negative causality. When the carbon tax goes up, carbon emission supposedly should go down. When the driving speed goes down, when I slow down my car, the time to destination will increase. It takes a longer time. See, those arrows are moving in the opposite direction. Usually we put a dotted line to show this negative causality. Sometimes you will see a negative sign by the arrowhead. Those are two different notations, but they know the same. They are moving in the opposite directions. Okay. Now I talk about the grammar of system language. Now loop is like the sentence, if you will. Why is loop important? A feedback loop, because our fundamental belief is that the behavior that we observe in the real world, the different type of pattern, let's say our revenue growth is exponentially growing. This we can observe, right? We have data to track. This behavior has an underlying systemic structure that generates this behavior. And our job as a system thinker, mapper, designer, is to unearth the underlying systemic structure that's responsible for this dynamic pattern. So feedback loop are those that responsible or help generate those dynamic patterns. The very first pattern we usually see is this reinforcing feedback loop. What's underlying it is a reinforced, this is exponential growth, is the behavior. What's underlying is a reinforcing feedback loop. Revenue, more revenue. Where does the revenue come from? Sales. What drives sales? Because you have good branding power. And where the branding come from? You do a lot of marketing. So more revenue, I allocate more budget to marketing, increases my branding, so that I have more sales, leads to more revenue, which creates more and more and more. Right? It reinforces itself and it goes up. This is what we also call the growth engine of this case, an enterprise. Of course, there are many other growth engine, R&D budget, product development, increases your sales, so on and so forth. So there will be many reinforcing feedback loop in your companies or in your change efforts. It is critical to identify those reinforcing engines in your change efforts, because that will self-reinforce that you don't need to keep on investing. You close the loop, allow the system to keep on regenerate the very thing you're trying to restore, regenerate. So that's reinforcing loop. And we want to identify those in the system. And I'll say a little bit more. And many times, the same loop can go into the opposite direction, which is a vicious cycle, right? You could have less revenue, less budget, less branding, less sales. It goes worse. And identify those points where you can tip the system from a vicious cycle to a virtuous cycle. It's where the system design comes in. The second type of loop, very quickly, is the balancing feedback loop, where you have the behavior in the system is that we have a goal in the system, and we have a pattern of moving towards that goal. So in this case, I'm a product developer in a company. I have a desired product feature in my mind. Let's say 10. I start with 1. I need to close the gap. And how do I do that? Through various R&D investments. So to map out what I just said in a system language would look like this. I have a desired product feature, 10 features. My current state of the system, I only have 1. There's a gap, right? This minus that, that's the gap. The gap then trigger me, my managerial action in this intervening in the system is R&D investment. So this gap trigger me to do more investment so that it will increases the feature. The blue line will keep on increasing and the gap will close over time until I reach my goal. When the gap is 0, I stop investing. So balancing feedback loop is a stabilizing force in system. It allows us, the system, to gradually move towards an equilibrium, towards a certain goal that the actor is seeking in the system. Whereas reinforcing feedback loop is destabilizing, right? In the exponential growth or exponential decay. It is the combination of these two loops that generate various dynamic behavior. And our job is trying to identify those loops that are responsible for those behaviors so that we can find out where the root cause might be, where the leverage point might be. So those are some of the dynamic thinking. So mapping is not just about mapping so this is related to that. It's also mapping the underlying causal dynamic that's responsible for the big dynamic behavior. Lastly, I also want to share another language in system dynamics called stock and flow diagram. We use it to capture an important quantity that gets accumulated over time. And we want to distinguish what increases it and what decreases it. So this stock, you can think about it like a bathtub of water. Water can get accumulated over time by opening up the faucet, so the inflow. It can drain out through the outflow, right? Opening the outflow drain. So there's inflow rate and outflow. So in practical example, number of population can go up and down. Birth rate, more number of people per year increases, will open up this valve, population will go up. Number of people dying per year goes up, it will drain, it will go down, the population will go down. Same thing with cash on hand in a company, revenue rate goes up, expense rate drain it out. So when you do your mapping, you can start identify what's the key variable, number of fisheries, number of biodiversity, carbon emission, whatever the thing that you care about, what's the inflow, what's the outflow. And then we can begin to identify what are the things that drive the inflow and outflow, right? What's responsible for the dynamic behavior of the key stock that you care about. Okay. So far I have explained some basic system thinking language. Now I want to shift. By the way, if you guys have questions, just jump in. I cannot see you, so I don't know. But if you have questions, just jump in.
They're also already very active in the chat, so I am responding to those. And I'll jump out if I think there's something that'd be really good for the group. I'll make sure to voice it.
Thank you. Great. Okay. All right. So now let's come to the different types of map and the objective. We are using map for facilitating system change. And there are different stages of system change initiative. First stage is initiation and envisioning, right? How do you bring a group of people working on a similar issue towards that same North Star? So initiation, envisioning. We need to craft a vision around what we can gather together and identify those stakeholders needed to shift the system. The two types of map that can help with that is vision map and stakeholder mapping. So that's a very early stage, small group of people, let's say IMP plus, right? We're trying to shift the best we can and help shifting towards more system level investing, system change investing. What's our vision of the future, right? Of the ideal state? Who are the key players that we need to engage, right? So this is at this stage of kind of do that initial mapping. After that, this is the critical part. We need to come to system understanding because we're dealing with a very complex system, that big elephant where we only see a part of it. Each of us only see a part of it. So how do we see that all together? We need to identify the key system health indicators. How do we know it's healthy or not? We need to try develop the causal theory. What drives that healthy indicator? What depleted? And it's very important that explicit and implicit rules. So when you're mapping a system, there are actual physical structure that you can map. Like if I want to restore fishery, right? The biology of fishery is explicit. There's science behind it. But there are many implicit rules. People's decision. We are not only mapping the biology or the physical structure, we are mapping how stakeholders are intervening, either intentionally or unintentionally in the system. What's their mental model when they make that decision? Because their limited mental model cause very unintended consequences. Mapping can help us unearth that so that we can examine that collectively and expand our boundary, right, and shift our mental model together. So that also are some of the implicit rules that is important. Through systems mapping, we're trying to map that out. Trying to map out the feedback loop and the leverage point. So a big complex map, usually we will then distill to a more simplified core theory of change map out of that complex spaghetti map. And it's also important at this stage to identify who's involved in this current system, right? So the system actor map. Like the actual organizations. This is a stakeholder group, but this is the actual actors, organizations, persons who are on different points that we should engage, partner, and so on and so forth. This stage is still at system understanding. It's not designing or solution yet, because we must go slow to go fast, right? To first understand the underlying causal structure before we intervene. So this part is understanding the system. Then we move into system design. Network building is important because by building a network of like-minded stakeholders who wants to move in the same direction, we need to create a collaborative network where, and it's intentional, right? We have a similar intention why we want to come together to shift the system and facilitate the flow of information and resources. So a network map to help with that. When we identify those leverage points in system understanding phase, it's also important then to do intervention design, right? On those leverage points, what are the different pathways that we can act on that leverage point. Designing the new systemic structure for each leverage point. This is where we use pathway map on that particular leverage point. Later on, Brian will share a case where we identify, seaweed farming is a high leverage point for sequestered carbon in the blue carbon space. And we done a pathway map just to map out how to actually increase more seaweed farming as an example of a pathway map.
Joe, Allie's got a good question I think we can address, which is she asks what's the difference between a stakeholder map and a systems actor map?
Yeah. This is still at a high level of identifying what are the key stakeholder groups, government, academia, right? Different type of categories and their interests, their power dynamic. So you have beginning to have a better sense of what kind of stakeholder group do we need to involve in this process. So this is the process to identify who to engage, who to interview, who to bring them into the system. Is at that level. Whereas here is when we are doing the mapping at this very complex map, out of it, we actually map out the very specific individual or organization. So it's beyond just the category, but it's actually down to exactly who and what's their interest, what are they working on, what project are they working on, and so on and so forth, and what's their goal, right? And how can we support them? How can they support us? What's the give and take, so on and so forth. So that's the difference. Okay. So same thing, the same type of actor map at the system level can also be at the pathway, right? At that pathway solution, you can also have different actors they are acting on that level. And the reason we want to do this mapping is many times they either don't know each other, or if they know each other, they don't necessarily have the trust, right? So how do we know who they are, who they're working, so that we can bring them together to create a space for collaboration? And this will give us a guide on who and how to engage. Last but not least, you do understanding, you design the pathway down to the actual action are those ventures, right? Either a nonprofit or social enterprise. Those ventures, you can also do mapping to help at the venture level. What's the venture's theory of change? Their logic model can also be mapped in a causal way to make it explicit. And it's important to think about this type of venture are systems aware venture, right? They are aware of the larger system, which leverage point are they sitting on? So their theory of change is linked to the larger theory of change. And that's an ideal way, even though you're still working at the tree level, but you see the whole forest and you see how your positioning help to regenerate the whole forest. So that's that type of map. So for today's sharing, following sharing, we want to share 3 types of map, which is one for system understanding, how we use the map to build system understanding with the stakeholder. We will share a pathway map, how when you have a solution comes out, how to use that to design the solution. And then also a venture map. Those are 3 that we will share. So the first one, mapping for system understanding. This is the case for understanding the social and economic cost of fishery collapse. This is in Upper Gulf, Mexico. A case that I did many years ago, I think about a decade ago, with the Walton Family Foundation and also the many local stakeholders. What's the problem? What's the systemic problem? So, at the beginning, there are abundance of fish, right? And humans show up. Lots of catch, both legal and illegal catch. causes the fishery to collapse. So we all know this problem very well. So just imagine, I invite you to all sit as if you're in that space. Imagine you're in this fishing village. The fish are depleting, right? And the government comes in and set a quota. You can only fish 1/3 of the normal catch. And if you are the fisherman, suddenly you have this rule imposed on you. What would you do? You riot, because what else can you do? There's no other income. So it causes a lot of social unrest when you have this top-down intervention. So what's the system's challenges? What are the system challenges? Let's start using mapping as a way to help us unearth it. Here are some of the key variables can capture that, begin to capture that. The problem is overfishing, causes the fish stock to go down. Because overfishing, when you overfish, you flood the market with a lot of fish. The fish price also drop, cause a lot of income instability. Sometimes you have fish, sometimes you don't have fish. Some price go up, go down, a lot of income instability. Also, there are a lot of illegal catch. And the type of gear they use, trolling gear, fish that are, under the bed of the sea, right? So a lot of habitat gets damaged in the fishing effort. There are a lot of mistrust among fisher, buyer, NGO, and government on the ground. And also many NGOs or civil society organizations are working hard in solving it, but there were silo actions. That some people are working on scientific study, some people are working on social engagement. They don't necessarily collaborate with one another. So if you are sitting in this village, what can you do? How can you help facilitate the shift, this stuckness in the system? The first step is we work with a few key stakeholders. There's a local organization called NOS that has been working on this issue for decades. They have close relationship with the local fishermen and local community. Through them, we start identify those stakeholders, and we start interviewing the various stakeholder, and we map the system. We map the system so that we host a workshop. We are doing mapping not for the sake of mapping. Mapping for us is only a tool, an engagement tool. It's an engagement tool to help us engage the stakeholders so that we can see the system, understand each other, form a shared vision, identify a leverage point. So through a stakeholder workshop across the system, from stakeholder across the system, from fishing cooperative, local governments, state governments, so on and so forth, NGOs, empowered with this participatory systems map. Here's what that spaghetti map looked like. I will share that in a bit. I want to give you a sense of what the actual room looks like in one of the settings. So this is in a village, fishing village. So in one of the rooms where you gather the key stakeholders. I wonder who's that handsome guy standing over there. Well, that was about 10 years ago. Time flies. So there was me, and also actually very important, my local partner, Alex, because usually you need to have someone who have deep relationship, not to say the language, which I don't speak Spanish, but we co-facilitated this stakeholder workshop with a live system mapping on the wall. I use this map to engage the stakeholder to let them see where they are and why they make their decisions and cause the very problem that we are experiencing. The best workshop is when you can enable the stakeholder to see we are the ones that create the very problem we are complaining. When you have that awareness that we are all part of the system, we are all part of the problem, then we can become part of the solution. So it's trying to facilitate that collective awareness, that consciousness shift, that we all contribute, either our action or inaction, or contribute to the very problem, so that we can all shift towards that same North Star. So that's what our workshop looked like. Organizationally, this is NOS. Alejandro is the leader of that organization. You know, a map can also be used to guide their internal strategy, where they think they can act in shifting the system. Okay, let me spend just quickly a few minutes to share with you what an actual map look like, so you have a sense and how to read a map. So what I'm showing now is a tool called Kumu, which is an online mapping tool that we use a lot, that you can access the map freely online anywhere. So what we care about is mature fish, right? That's our main stock. Remember I say you need to identify what's the key stock that you care about when you do your system change efforts. Then you want to map out the underlying inflow and outflow of the key stock. Okay, so in this case, I have a mature fish stock here. Where does that come from? Well, it came from juvenile baby fish. The inflow is regeneration rate, spawning the eggs. Fish, through time mature fish, they can either natural die, natural mortality rate, or through legal catch and illegal catch. Those are different pathways fish decline. So by using stock and flow, I can identify what causes the fishery to decline. Is it natural death through pollution? Is it through illegal log catching, or what? Then next step, you want to identify the causal logic behind it. Let me go faster. I want to share the key dynamic loop here, which is this R4. We talk about reinforcing feedback loop. The key dynamic of what causes this problem. If you have less fish in the ocean, you have less catch per boat, right? Every time you go out and catch, you catch less. So less catch, less income, less stability triggers more fishing effort. When you catch less every time, you go out twice instead of one time a day. So your fishing effort goes up, trigger you to catch even more, even less fish per boat, cause you to fish even harder, right? This is, we call a race for fish. So what I show you is a reinforcing loop, but in a vicious cycle. And that caused a severe decline. Everyone is trying to compete to fish the last fish before my neighbor fish it. And when I walk through this slowly and building this model with them, like the fishermen at the back of the room, like nodding heads quietly. That's exactly my mental model. That's exactly what I do, right? So you're trying to map out their behavior so that they can see their action in it and how they cause the system's various symptoms that we are witnessing. Then there's the price dynamic, how when you fish too hard, the fish will depress the price, lower the income, which trigger you to fish harder. And the type of gear you use will create habitat damage, which will lower the healthy ecosystem. And same thing, if you a lot of switch agriculture, but they are unsustainable agricultural practices, creates pollution, lowers the healthy ecosystem. This feeds back to the very problem, because when you have a polluted, damaged ecosystem, it reduces the lifespan of the fish, right? So the natural outflow rate increases, drains out is faster. So we now have to see how the economic behavior is related to the environmental behavior, well-being. The reds are some of the key indicators and key challenges. The blue are the interventions that we can intervene in the system. So in this case, the case of catch share is in place to help it. Not only you have a allowable catch, but each individual share, right? Each fishermen will have certain share to help them incentivize them to allow this fishery to get regenerated so that their pie gets bigger. In the interest of time, I don't want to go into all the detail, but I just want to share with you that you can continue to build this whole system. There is the alternative income part, scuba diving, alternative job training, income subsidy could help with that. There are other interventions like increasing the fishing quality, process improvement, certified fishing certification to increase the price premium, so that incentivize more sustainable catch. And this part is the civic engagement. All those solutions sounds great, but in order for this to happen, we must engage the stakeholder together to scale up those solutions. So,
hey, Joe.
Yeah.
Richard had a great question. I think this ties into really well. So he said, this approach looks very comprehensive, the kind of approach that a government would adopt. And he's asking for individual investors seeking to define where their interventions could be most effective and where they don't have access or leverage over all these stakeholders. How would you speak to how they can engage? And is this a feasible approach for individual investors?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it is important to have someone to help initiate this process. Well, let me say the ideal way. Ideal way is it doesn't have to be government. In fact, this is private funders, either a foundation, a philanthropist, or a group of investors coming together willing to fund this initial process. So this initial system mapping and sensing process. So they will identify low level and sorting those projects. This is where the individual investor can come in and say, my investment is targeting this leverage point. So someone would need to do that from part of the work and willing to fund that and support that. That's the ideal way. That's also our challenge in system change field is this lack of funding or willingness, either understanding willingness to fund this from part, but it's critical. That's the ideal way, but if you are constrained by it, I think it's still good to do at a project level. Like I said, the venture map, where your venture, what you're investing, you can still create a map from that venture's perspective and expand it out, how that venture is in trying to intervene in the wider system. That won't be from a systems perspective, but at least it will bring more system awareness into that venture. Yeah. But I think the solution, yeah, go ahead.
Just as a follow-on question, and this maybe is the link between the systems map and the ventures map. To what extent can you do, from a resource and time and focus constraint perspective, a schematic systems map, right? Not quite as complete, not quite as detailed as what you've got, that allows you to focus on, I'm making this up, of course, on the left side of the table, or the right side of the table, whatever it might be, and then say, look, I've determined the schematic stuff. I'm going to go deeper on this bit that you've highlighted, for instance. What are the risks? Of course, the risks in missing stuff and not getting the right dynamics, but how do you work that intelligently so that, yeah, you're schematic enough to be practical on the stuff you don't need and super focused on the rest without missing out? Are there sort of approaches or ways of doing it that you recommend, or how would you? I guess.
Yeah. So that actually is a good segue for me to go to next stage. When we do this mapping, it's very complex, a big spaghetti map. There are a lot of detail. There are a lot of detail complexity in it. But we need to step back and try to identify what are the core dynamics out of this structure that is generalizable. There's a generic structure when people are facing similar problem in different countries. What's that generic structure? So a map like this, a more simplified map, we call it a theory of change map, is trying to get at that. Where, for example, in this case, what they are, the key fish stock, the economic, social, environment, and how they are also related. right? More healthy ecosystem leads to more fish, more sustainable catch, more income stability, cost instead of less polluting activity, and so on and so forth. So you create a more generic structure to capture the complexity. Here you distill that detailed complexity, but you can take the same structure into other places and add the detail that fits that, in a way, customize it, if you will, for that specific space. That's one way I would think about it. And so actually interesting, Charlie in the morning was asking, I guess, similar question about, are there kind of generic maps that we can use in different issues? And my response to that is, we don't really see one that really sorting it out. Maybe some of you know, if you know, let me know that. But I know there are different maps out there, but whether some has curated that is a work that we need to do for the field. We certainly have a lot of experience in different issues, but to kind of bring them together and distill it so that other people can replicate and use, I think it's something that is needed to be done for the field. Okay, let me quickly continue to share 2 other maps so that you have a sense what others look like. And before I turn to Brian, I want to share with you this from our experience. When you do mapping, there's this timeline over time. This is the degree of complexity. It's very likely as your mapping complexity increases, you will hit this dotted line, tolerance for handling complexity. In your mind, you're like, oh, that's too complex, too messy. Right? Let me just go back to what I'm comfortable with, what I know best, what I can act the most effective. So you're back to silo thinking. Our challenge as systems leaders, investors, is to help cultivate our collective capacity to hold complexity, is to bring people together to go beyond that comfort zone. We are not going forever, otherwise you'll be analysis paralysis. We want to go to a sufficient point where then we can see that elephant, we can calm down and distill that core structure that I just shared. Here we arrive at strategic clarity, strategic strategy, as opposed to the silo decision. Both are under the comfort zone, but one has gone through the period of pain, but arrive at a higher intervention. And that's our work, is how to bring people through this process. Okay, so with that, and lastly, in this case, the actual map was used to convene other funders together to develop a 5-year collective funding strategy, using the map as a decision support to help people form a shared strategy. So in summary, at a system understanding phase, a map is good for understanding the system, form shared vision, identify lever, identify relevant actor, stakeholder, build trust, form partnership, and very importantly, communicate the theory of change to the public, and facilitate ongoing action learning process. The map should be a living map because we should continue to revisit it as we intervene, the system will shift. Right.
Can I ask a question, Joe?
Yes, please.
Jump in. I'm curious because you bring all these actors together, right, in the systems mapping process. You leverage all the different knowledge and experience that everybody has in the room. How do you bring them together, maybe with sort of, I think somebody else asked that too, in terms of scientific data and other things like that. How do you sort of, because you identify the high leverage points through that collective understanding, do you then cross map that with some scientific data or evidence or anything else? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah. So in this case, the partner is EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, right? So they bring their marine scientists and their data. How do we know the fish or the current fish stock is declining? What's the actual evidence of it, right? In the map, the fish stock, what I created is a qualitative map, but you can actually put number in it. You should put number in it if you have the data. You should put as much number as data on it as possible, so that you will guide our decision. Right? And if there are variables that we do not have data and it's important, then we should do research to find out that, so that it will inform our decision. So that's how we intersect the qualitative map for engagement, but also taking out wherever the data has to inform the level of the variable in the map. Okay.
So can I ask a very quick one?
Please.
Just on the engagement process, Joe. So, and sorry if I missed it, but are you usually bringing a first draft of the map to a broader group of stakeholders and then let them comment on and play with it, and then you add to it, rather than starting with a blank sheet of paper with them?
Okay, good question. So both works. So remember I said the very initial phase, usually during this, during this, when there are a smaller group of people, this is the core team, I would do the real-time mapping with them, put out the stickies, put out the key variable, causal connection. So at this level, we can begin to create a very high-level skeletal map that's in the room with the key group. But at this level, when you are engaging with a wider stakeholder, it's better to create a map beforehand through interviewing, through desktop research, to create that big map that I just shared. Even though you create that, how you use it is also an art. If you just present it like I did to you, sometimes you get lost. But if you in an actual workshop, you want to do it very slowly, you want to do it in a very engaging way, you know, and what is your experience and what else is missing, and you start putting it on there in real time, right? And so the map becomes their map. Of course, the map will be missing, and my intention is to gather what's missing so I can refine it. So the next time when they see the map, they own the map, right? It's their map. So yeah, so at this stage, I would say if it's a very complex issue, do a pre-map. We call it a shadow map before we host the workshop and refine the map. And sometimes you need to do several rounds to get to a good enough confidence. And those are not wasted time, because you will need to engage and build trust anyways. This is just a tool to help you do that, right? So, okay, yeah, go ahead.
Joe, quickly, when do the investors then come in? Is it rather like the people that are affected by a social problem that are initially part of the process, and the investors come in later? Do you have some experience? When is a good moment to involve the investors and the funders into the process?
The usual way is at a later stage, when you have mapped out the pathway, you identify those the projects, and the investors come in. But I would say the ideal way is the front end, which is at initiation. If you can already identify the like-minded investor and funder who are intentionally wanting to catalyze change, system change, who wants to invest in system change, is at this stage, that's ideal. They then together work with the stakeholder, the change side, right, to form that initial committee. So they are part of this process. We have a project, Cancer-Free Economy, that was designed that way. The network was intended to work not only on the change side, but also engaging the funder at the beginning, so that the funders can also fund collaboratively in the system. So yeah, so that would be, I would say that's the ideal. And in that case, you will need, I guess, a lead funder who can then bring others together. And then, you know, we identify the issue, we identify the key change side, and we work together and form that collaborative and start this process. I would say that would be the ideal.
Probably rather the philanthropic funders first, and then
yes, usually it's usually the front part has to be ideally philanthropic fund, because so that it's like R&D, right? You need to R&D, that you're doing due diligence on this system. You need to spend some money, R&D on it, before you invest your money into it.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Brian, you want to go ahead?
Sure, happy to.
Okay.
Share my screen. So Joe just shared again. Joe is sharing the example of the mapping for systems understanding, our whole systems map. And then after we use that to narrow in on those leverage points or those potential sources of leverage, then the question goes to how do we design interventions, effective interventions, to make this happen. And that intervention can be the size of a single company, but it can also be the size of some industrial transformation or some economic transformation. So in this case, I'm going to share some ongoing work that we're doing with the Environmental Defense Fund on using natural climate solutions, particularly oceanic or blue carbon solutions, in order to do that. So we actually already did in an earlier round, supported by the Bezos Earth Fund, supported some scientific consensus building, where we brought together scientists who look at, or who are experts in all kinds of marine systems, from mangroves to whales to benthic trawling to everything else, and brought them together and said, let's think about these systems and their relationship to carbon. If we grow the stock of whales, we grow the stock of mangrove forests, or is that going to contribute as a net carbon sink or net carbon source? And how can we think about identifying those that are a net sink and then potentially intervening to increase them, so we don't have to resort to some really crazy or some more high risk solutions for carbon removal technology. So we got together with the scientists, we tried to reach consensus on what we know and don't know. This is sort of a one way to get at the data question. So we were engaging directly with scientists and saying, how do you see and synthesize the data? And then we built conceptual models to illustrate connections. So not just looking at carbon, but also looking at the co-benefits and risks, the social and the other environmental co-benefits and risks to this action. And there was even potential further work to develop this into a quantitative model. I'm definitely not going to touch these maps, but to just give you a sense of when you deal with the cutting edge science and you're trying to synthesize a number of areas, there was a lot to talk about. And actually most of the really good dialogue happened, around the map, but our goal was not to ever, sort of publish these maps. But what we decided after looking at all of these different areas across open ocean, nearshore, and macroalgae or seaweed, is to focus in on two particular pathways. One was growing seaweed or macroalgae, which is this pathway map here, and the other one would be to work on some new types of fishing and trying to limit or sustainably manage that fishing. So if I jump over here to our Kumu map, and I'm not going to go through this in the same level of detail as Joe went through the fisheries one, but I will just give you a high-level sense of what we're up to here. So we have our stock and flow. Joe mentioned that structure in his earlier thing. On the far right-hand side, we have this carbon flow. So it starts with decreasing, that's why it's red, decreasing the stock of carbon in the atmosphere through these processes of removal and storage. First through, this is the seaweed map, so first in growing the stock of seaweed, and then hopefully finding ways to make sure that that doesn't just get re-released into the atmosphere by sequestering it down into the deep ocean or other places. And then this main stock and flow here in the center of the screen looks at cultivation of seaweed, but then how do you use it at the end? Seaweeds can decompose and go back to the atmosphere very quickly. So we're looking at developing different products that would help sequester that carbon that's in the biomass, whether it's bioplastics or food or additives that are just to help with avoided emissions because they're better than what's being used currently. The other side is to potentially look at sinking that biomass directly to the deep sea, where pressure and temperature will keep it locked away in timescales of hundreds of years. And from here, so once we kind of lay out the key structure of this map, then we start looking at so many of the processes and resources that go into this type of work. So we will look at a number of things. So we'll look at the, let me take a look here at primary processing, but we have these yellow boxes, which are various resources that we need to grow. So whether that's a farm site or it's permitting or vessels, we'll look at the processes by which those resources are created. So selecting and preparing increases our stock of farm sites. Measuring and monitoring increases our stock of seaweed data, which helps with the process of rearing and breeding seaweed. And then for each of these processes and each of these resources, we have different stakeholder groups which are responsible for addressing those things. So consultants, regulators, farms, academia, so on and so forth. And what we're doing with this is the first step. We're laying out this kind of theoretical pathway for how this industry should develop. The next step is then going to various people who could, may, or do identify as being involved in this pathway, and then finding out where we have resources and where we don't have resources, helping us conduct a little bit of a gap analysis and get one step closer to identifying the ventures that will be needed. I think it's really important to mention, and I think Joe touched on this before, is though even though we've zoomed in to addressing the creation of a pathway, it's always with the larger system in mind. So even though our goal here on the far right-hand side of the screen is to sequester carbon, use this for sequestering carbon, we're always keeping those co-benefits and risks in mind. So we'll reference back to the whole systems map as we go along. That's just a little taste of pathway mapping. Do we have any quick questions on pathway mapping before we jump into the venture side?
I just want to chime in a little bit earlier, say where the investor sees in. This is where investor can see themselves more. When you do the pathway mapping, this is where investment opportunity comes in, right? Either at a farming stage, at a harvesting, processing. The earlier map, which system understanding, only the purpose identified level. But when you get down to the pathway mapping, this is where we can source those investable projects.
Joe, back over to you.
Okay, great. Now, last but not least, I want to share the venture map. So let's say we identify the pathway we source a particular startup or venture. You can also apply a similar process at the venture level. And this is the case. I shared the detail of this in my last talk at IMP. So I'm going to quickly walk through it. This is a case that happened in Taipei, where I'm currently residing. It's a company called Hsueh Group. Their purpose is to regenerate a zone economy. By that, they define a main street, a particular quarter. In this case, it's a historical district in Taipei that was degraded. And what they did is they rent those historical houses and then convert them into youth and art incubation centers for youth entrepreneurship artisans to come in. Here are the 50 shops inside those historical houses, because they are spreading out different places. By strategically spreading out, it started to create new vibe into the community. More and more people start to come in, both the artists and also the RT consumers. So now it's the hippest area in Taiwan, in Taipei, the favorite tourist area for Japanese when they come to Taiwan. So in a way, it's a small place-based system change, but the same model can be replicated into other districts. And so SIMFO in this case is both an investor of theirs, and we also located I'm sitting here right here, somewhere here. Actually, yeah, here, right? Where we're sitting right here. There's a temple, goddess temple, that people come and pray for. They love God when they come pray for their romance. Yeah. So what our role is, both help the company to come up with their strategy for the future and using the map as a tool for fundraising. You can think about mapping can be a tool for as like a investment prospectus. Company is very complex. There are many interventions. In this case, shop houses, they have online university, they have online marketplace, so on and so forth. How they are causally connected towards their social goal and what's their financial goal and how they're interconnected. So that's the complex map. This is a simplified map or the theory of change map. So you can also do the similar process at the company level to help them get a better sense of what's their ecosystem look like and use that to communicate both with their investors and also with their partners. And that's at this level. Okay, we still have a little bit time. Brian can lead a little exercise for us to practice.
All right. Okay, my screen's back up, right? Yeah, great, thanks, Chili. Okay, so we're gonna start with a blank canvas here, and we're going to do a little exercise where we build up our systems map from scratch. So Rujo has made you all experts in sustainable fisheries management so far. So we're going to walk through the process of building up that core loop that we saw, that core dynamic right here in real time. And so where we typically want to start is with our state of the system. What is this variable that we care about that is that we're tracking its behavior over time, and that it is sort of an indicator for everything else. So anyone want to venture a guess as to what it was in the example that we gave earlier?
So fish stock or something like that, right? Number of fish.
Yeah, that was a good one, right? So this is what was driving everything else. And great, so from there, and this is the thing we have a vision for, right? So we want to track its behavior, and we want to see that return to sustainable levels. And if we remember, one of the effects of that fish stock going down, and as I build this, I'll say that it's always useful when we build this to pick a direction. So in this case, I say, as the fish stock goes down, what happens? And in the case we shared, is there was the catch per unit effort that went down, and the total catch that went down as well. So every time the fisher went out, they applied a certain amount of effort, and then that resulted in their total yield for the day. So I draw these little connections, causal connections here. We remember that as the fish stock went down, the catch per unit effort also went down. And so because these two things move in the same direction as this goes down, so too does this one. That is, Joe described, would be positive causality. So we'll have this solid line reflecting that. Same thing with the catch per unit effort. So when I do the behavior here, I'm just thinking about the relationship between the two variables. So I for a moment, forget about all the rest of the connections and just say what happens to the total catch for the day when their catch per unit effort changes. What happens to the catch per unit effort when the stock goes down? And that's how I define my polarity. And from there, we had an awareness that as the catch went down, this created income instability. And again, I look at catch, I look at income instability, and I say, as catch goes down, income stability goes up. So down and up. So these two move in opposite directions. So in that case, even though income stability is going up, because the two things move in opposite directions, that reflects the fact that I have a negative causality. They move in opposite directions. So I use this dashed line to represent that. And then finally, the decision variables that as that income stability, that income instability went up, which was the really terrifying thing for the fishers, then they would go out and they would apply more fishing effort. So as instability went up, so did their effort. So that's a solid line. And finally, as fishing effort went down, that accelerated the rate. More fishing means less fish stock. So more fishing, less fish stock. And what I do to determine the behavior of the loop, so Joe mentioned we have balancing loops that seek a goal and reinforcing loops which create change in the system. I would walk all the way through the loop to see what happens when I get through the loop. What is the behavior of this loop every time I go through it? So a reinforcing loop will exhibit the same behavior over and over and over every time we walk through the loop. A balancing loop will oscillate back and forth between going up and going down. So in this case, I have a fish stock, it goes down. So then does catch per unit effort goes down, catch goes down, income instability goes up, fishing effort goes up, and fish stock goes back down again.
Brian, can I ask a question?
Please.
When you talked about, or when Joe talked about the reinforcing loop and the balancing loop, if this was the model, and obviously it's a zillion times more complicated than this, is what you're trying to do basically convert a reinforcing loop into a balancing loop? As in, are you trying to essentially think where you can have an intervention onto, let's say, fishing effort or catch or whatever it might be, to turn this into a different sort of loop? Or are you trying to, yeah, as in, is that the process, or are they two separate things? And I know that's far too simplistic.
That's a fantastic question, Simon. Thank you. No, so we said before that there's a goal, right? So when we have a balancing loop, that's seeking some goal. That can be an organic goal, something that happens in nature, but it can also be a goal that we set. So for example, this is a reinforcing loop, and more colloquially, we might call this a vicious cycle. And one of our goals would be to create a virtuous cycle. And so how would you create a virtuous cycle from this? Well, if you reverse the behavior, if I said, instead of saying, oh, when the fish stock goes down, catch goes down, income instability goes up, fishing effort goes up, fish stock goes down again. If I instead said that when the fish stock goes up, catch goes up, income instability goes down, fishing effort stabilizes, and the fish stock goes up, then we have a virtuous cycle. So actually what we're talking about is sort of a flywheel of change. It can go down, it can go exponentially down, or it can go hopefully, up to a certain level. Of course, there's still carrying capacity. It can't go up forever. We do have limits to growth. But for example, when Joe mentioned that there was an intervention put into place, which was the quota. So what they were trying to do with the quota is they basically said, well, there's only so much that you can do. It doesn't matter how hard you want to work. We are going to limit this. So the lower the quota, sorry, this should be the same. So the lower the quota, the lower the catch. The higher the quota, the higher the catch. So if we want to create a balancing loop, what would we do? Well, we would then connect the fish stock through research and understanding what this really means to the quota. So as the fish stock goes up, then our quota can go up and the allowable catch can go up. And so then the catch goes up, this goes down, and it functions in that positive way. So even though this is still a reinforcing loop, right? It's this intervention is going to help us reverse the direction of this this behavior. And I think what's important to note about this is there's also time delay in the system. So it's not that this is going to happen immediately. It's not going to be that we're going to adjust the quota every day or every week, but that we would have this control mechanism. So frequently the intervention is to increase the speed at which we have informational feedback in the system.
Just in this case, we're thinking about what are the different interventions that can shift this reinforcing loop into a virtuous loop. What are some examples? For example, in the system, government provides subsidy, but if they provide fuel subsidy, what they do is actually increase fishing effort even more, right? So it's actually triggering this even more. Whereas if they shifted and through this dialogue, use the same amount of money for income subsidy, where the income subsidy now addressing at income inequality, instability. By providing that income subsidy, you stabilize it, you prevent this vicious cycle going downwards, right? And so this is where we start to identify different intervention at multiple points to shift the system from a vicious to a virtuous cycle.
So can I just, if I can simplify even further, right? I'm only trying to do two things. I'm trying to identify vicious circles and establish interventions which turn them into virtual cycles. And if I can find virtual cycles, I'm trying to speed them up. And that's what I'm trying to do, right? Two things. That's it. That's it. That's incredibly complicated. But those are the two things you're trying to do, right?
It's a key way that we think about it. Yes. Is it the only thing we need to know? Probably not, but it is. When we show those theories of change, they are typically centered around what is that change we want to see, and if we can identify that virtuous circle and make it go faster, yes.
Yeah, that's one simple way of thinking about it, I will have to say, because there are other dynamic behavior, like overshoot and collapse. There are other type of behavior that you will need different type of intervention. But a typical one is what you just mentioned. There are vicious cycle in the system, and then we should identify that so that we can find ways to shift that system. Yeah, so a good exercise for us, if you want to do it at home, is the investment you are working on. What are the vicious cycle you see in the system you're trying to intervene? See if you can map that out, and what might be some of the levers to help shift it.
Beck asks, do you find that most of the most effective interventions need to be executed by government, Joe?
No, I think government certainly play a big role, but actually not necessarily the most effective intervention. Like for example, the fishery case, yeah, if they come top down impose this quota, it's effective, but what it triggers is this social riot and cause even more illegal logging, fishing. So a bottom-up approach like this is helpful because it's through this collective process, the community build their vision, share vision. They actually come up with 5-point strategy on how to manage their own fishery and then propose back to the government. And the government was like, wow, the first time the fishermen come to us with a proposal. And so it was happily accepted and implemented, right? So government should be a partner, not an imposer in a way. And we need a process to involve the government so they can make the more effective decision or rules or regulation. And mapping is a tool to help that. Yeah.
Joe, can you speak a little bit more towards, I think Richard was kind of touching on this question earlier too about, there's quite a bit of individual investors in this group. And there's that incredible systems mapping, right? Super extensive. And I think some people feel like, wow, that's maybe too much, or that's, you know, how do I even get started? Or, you know, it can feel kind of overwhelming. Like, in what ways do you feel like for individual investors, this can be made practical, easily implementable? Like, what does that process look like? If I'm Ali and I want to invest in fisheries in Portugal, what could that process look like in a way that's feasible for individual investors, or do I have to actually from default, you know, already from the outset start recruiting a lot of other stakeholders and engage other people? So could you speak to that?
Yeah, great question, difficult question. I think a little bit what I shared earlier. I think if even just at the individual level, if you want to apply this way of thinking to map out from that single investments perspective, what is the social or environmental problem it's trying to solve? What's the causal logic? Just from that point, could gain a better understanding. But you will quickly hit the point where they're so complicated, other parts that this company is not touching on, but that needs to be shifted, right? This is where I have to say, we need to have that system convener funder come into the system to fund this process. It's critical. It's critical. And by the way, this is where SIMFO and Colombia are cultivating this system investing alliance, and I would love to share that with the group here. Trying to begin to see if we can bring those funders either from family office, foundations, financial institution, to specifically meet this challenge to fund system change, this early part, through grants, right? Imagine you have that funder funding those grants, mapping it out, so the rest of us can just follow, can just co-invest through it. That would be much more effective and help it scale over time. So that's my solution, is to actually at that field level to build this collective funding mechanism to make that happen. Otherwise, it is tough for individual investors to take on so much. Yeah.
I had a question on, I think this is great, but also like regarding Richard said, it's a comprehensive approach, and how do you account for kind of unknowns and unintended consequences, and kind of doing this in a not thorough enough way to have, you know, unknowns that create negative loops that's negative. Do you have any thoughts on that?
You mean like unforeseeable financial uncertainty, shocks?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, things that you don't know about. You think you know the system enough, but there's unknowns that you don't know about that might react opposite, or like, how do you know what you know and what you don't know, and how well do you know the system to actually intervene?
Yeah. I would say that mapping is a tool to help us discover what we know, our current mental model boundary, and what other people know, and so begin to expand that scope. But we will never see the whole elephant. That's impossible. We'll only get close to it. So this is important to have that learning mindset. As I get to this much, after I interview so many people, this is extent that we know the system. When the shock actually comes beyond our wild, like for example, COVID, right? Nobody expect that. But if it actually happens, then I must incorporate it into the model and see how you interact with the model. So in a way, the model is dynamic, it's living. I will do my best wild guess and thinking about what are the possible scenario and try to incorporate. But the ones that I just can't think about, can only try to incorporate after the fact, right? And adapt to it. So it's helping us to gain that collective understanding as we venture into this complexity and learn from it and iterate over it. That's the qualitative way. Now, the quantitative way is you can actually have actual data and you're doing modeling, and then you're trying to see whether the structure actually capturing the fit the data. That will give you a clue on what's missing in your model. And so that you can then say, oh, my mental model is limited to this form, but the data is here. My model doesn't fit that. So there are other structure that's missing. So that's the quantitative way of trying to see the limit of my mental model, what are the missing structure. If we don't use the quantitative model, then the qualitative model is what I just said. It's through this stakeholder engagement, you expand it, and you try to incorporate along the way those uncertainties.
It reminds me, Joe, of Donella Meadows. There are her 12 leverage points in the system, with the highest one being recognition that a paradigm is just a paradigm and it's inherently flawed. So and then obviously the second leverage point is actually shifting the paradigm, but that the highest one, it relates just as much to the systems map, I guess, because it's mapping out your paradigm in a way. Your mental model. How do you see the world? What is it this like? So it reminds me of that. And I just want to take the last minute to just say a massive thank you to both you and Brian for hosting this so generously for all of us. I know it's been one of those topics that's been bubbling up a lot in all these case studies, with some people having these extensive maps and other people don't. And like, how do you get started? What does it look like? What are the different types? I loved that overview with the different types of mapping. That was really helpful. So I just really I appreciate you taking the time to educate all of us and see how we might leverage these different mapping tools for our own work. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for participating. I love share our work. And usually we work with the change side, and so now it's wonderful, and I hope more can come out of this, or we can move this more forward into the investment community.
Yeah, I think there's lots more conversations to be had on that, but this was a good starting point to get us all up to speed on the language and on the framework. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Simon says he's gone from 1% to 4.5% knowledge, so that's a big increase.
That's been generous to myself. It was really brilliant, guys. Thank you so much. Incredible. Really brilliant. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Okay.
Great
All
stuff.
right. Take care.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.